So I'm going to start my message a little different, kind of a different way than I normally do. And I'm going to start with a picture. So I've got a picture up here. If you guys can see that. And that's a man named Hiro Onoda. And you may or may not know his story. If you look at his uniform, he is a military man. And he was a young intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army during World War II. And he was deployed, and he was trained in kind of counter-surveillance, and his whole job was to go and gather intelligence on a Philippine island called Lubang Island in 1944. And so his couple of big things he was called to do was to disrupt communication and to surveil the enemy, which at the time was the United States of America, who had control of the Philippine Islands. And so eventually, American warships would show up to the island a few months after he got there, and he and his men, essentially the Americans come in, and he and his men get beat over and over and over again in gunfights and skirmishes. And Onoda's guys have to retreat back up into the mountains of the island to kind of hide out and wait it out. And for a few months, they kind of hear in the distance, they hear kind of cleanup squads, they hear gunfire as his men are getting picked off, and they're more and more isolated. And there's him and 4 guys in the mountains, just with this sense of impending doom. Like, the Americans are coming for me. But one day, the gunfire stops. And that day turned into like a week, and then several weeks, and these American cleanup squads that seemed to assume that their job was done. Or did they? Again, Onoda, trained in surveillance, trained in propaganda. He thought they might have stopped firing to trick Onoda and his men into believing they were safe, to get them to come down from the mountains. And so they stay in the mountains despite there not being any obvious signs left of American forces, until one day in 1945, they hear a sound overhead, and it's real loud. It's a diesel roar of an engine. An American plane flies by, and Onoda knew, the American military are going to finally finish the job. And sure enough, the plane doors open, and he's getting ready for them to drop what he thinks is going to be a bomb, and he holds his breath, and he waits for the impact, and nothing comes. And then he starts to hear rustling, almost like someone playing with a Bible, just rustling, and he realizes there's just a bunch of papers. It's like, and he picks one up, and he reads it, and it says in Japanese, "The war is over, come down from the mountains." And he reads it, and again, he was told really clearly during his training, you never leave your post. Unless your commanding officer tells you to leave your post, you never leave your post. And he's trying to be a man of honor and loyalty, and so he gets the paper, and he's immediately suspicious, and he thinks this is a trick. And honestly, from what I understand, the paper did have like a grammatical error, and it almost seemed like an American had transcribed Japanese that they had learned as like a second language, which is exactly what happened. And so he reads it, he's like, this is all wrong, man. This isn't legit. I don't believe this. And so what he didn't know is hundreds of miles away, a typist made an honest mistake, and it truly was an honest mistake. But his belief that it was enemy propaganda was a life-changing decision, because the war actually had ended. The Emperor of Japan had surrendered, and these notes were not fake, they were authentic. But because Onoda and his small unit believed these notes to be fake, they remained steadfast in their belief that the war was ongoing. So they stayed on the island for a few more years, believing, by the way, that they're in a combat zone. So they're getting into like gunfights with the Filipino police. They kill people. They're surviving on hunting and fishing, and they're evading authorities. And in 1950, so 6 years later, one of Onoda's men surrenders to the Philippine forces. However, Onoda that only like strengthened his resolve that he was not going to be taken. And so throughout this long isolation, Onoda strictly adheres to military discipline. He's maintaining his uniform. He's regularly cleaning his rifle. He continues surveillance on the island, completely unaware that the world has moved on from the war. Fast forward 25 years later, 30 years since the war has ended. A man named Norio Suzuki. He's a 20-something Japanese adventurer tourist, is how he's often described. Feels like a very millennial thing. I'm an adventurer tourist. And actually, I mean, he's got a real millennial origin story. He was born in the 50s. But before the trip, Norio had a fancy job in Tokyo, but he didn't find his work fulfilling. Again, very millennial. So he decided he wanted to travel. I'm a millennial. Take it easy. Now, again, so he goes on this mythical quest of a trip that definitely would have had a YouTube channel if he was alive today. He quits his job, he sells everything he has, and he heads out into the world. And it's not like, I just want to see some stuff. He's got goals. Norio Suzuki wants to see three things. He wants to see the abominable snowman in Nepal. He wants to see a panda in the wild in China. And he wants to see if he can find Lieutenant Onada, who is now famous in Japan as someone that they're pretty sure is alive, who has never come home. And Norio is pretty committed. He was pretty committed to the trip, by the way. He claimed to have seen an abominable snowman, and then, like, not to be funny, he died in an avalanche in Nepal trying to find the abominable snowman. So this guy is committed to this trip. But before he goes to Nepal, he finds Onada on Lubang Island. Like, he goes to the Philippines. He's there for a few days. He finds him. He sees a guy who speaks Japanese for the first time in a very long time. He gets to talk to another human. And they talk, and he's like, yo, dude, did you know the war is over? He's like, no, I don't believe it. And he said, unless my commanding officer tells me, I'm not leaving. And so, long story short, Suzuki talks to the Japanese government, and they call in Onada's former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, to personally relieve him of duty. Now, Major Taniguchi was no longer a major. As a matter of fact, he hadn't been in the military for about 25 years. He ran a grocery store. But he's like, you know what? I'm going for my guy. So he literally puts some uniform on. Japanese government flies him down. And in a very formal way, Major Taniguchi finds him and tells him, hey, the war is over. And in a very formal declaration, lets him know, hey, he can come home, disarm, that whole thing. So here's the thing. Onada had been by himself for over 20 years, fighting a war by himself that had been over for nearly 30 years. Onada said he didn't regret the 30 years he spent on the island, saying he was following orders. He did deeply regret killing dozens of Filipino civilians on Lubang Island for whom he assumed they were enemy combatants, when actually they were just villagers living their life. But in terms of staying, he did not feel bad about staying. Now, here Onada's story is a tragic one in many ways, and you might be wondering, Andy, why did you tell us this sad story? Is this because we're doing a series on emotional health? You're going to talk about sadness, trying to make us sad, tap into our sad feelings? And the answer is no. I'm not here to talk about sadness. The reason I'm telling you this story is because it illustrates the reality that what we think is true impacts the way we live. What we think impacts our emotions. Maybe more than anything else. Our thoughts impact our emotions. But it doesn't end there. Our thoughts impact our emotions, which impact our ability to love and live like Jesus. One author puts it this way: our life is always moving in the direction of our strongest thoughts. Now, you may not be holding out on an island in the Philippines for 20 years fighting a war, but I've lived long enough. I've been a pastor long enough. I've been a human long enough with my own experiences to know that, like some of you this morning, like you're living in a story that's not true and it's wearing you out. Like you have ideas and beliefs and thoughts that there's like a tyranny. Your thoughts are tyrannical. And you're stressed out and you're afraid and you're sad. And here's the thing, life is hard enough in a fallen world without extra untrue thoughts and narratives, if that makes sense. There are things to be sad about, but that gets compounded sometimes with our thought life. And again, I think this makes sense. Like when we think thoughts like, you can't trust people, no one will ever love the real you, you'll never succeed, you're always going to be broke, you're never going to have a good marriage, God doesn't hear your prayers, God doesn't care about you, you're never going to make a difference, you're never going to amount to anything, You've got to prove everyone wrong. You'll always be a victim. You'll never actually become like Jesus. Believing those things will impact how you feel. And for the purpose of this series, here's what I want to say. You'll never be more emotionally healthy than your thought life. This isn't all there is to emotional health, but you can't be emotionally healthy with less than this. You can't be emotionally healthy while maintaining an unhealthy thought life, which leads me to today's outline on how our thoughts and emotions intersect and how they help us move towards becoming like Jesus or moving us away from Christ-likeness. And I have 3 points today. And it's number one is we need to understand the importance of our thoughts. Number two, we need to engage our thoughts. Number three, we need to bring our thoughts to Jesus and his people. Now, when you see 3 points, you might get stressed out. How long are these points? How long are we going to be here? My thoughts are pretty good. I don't really need your thoughts, Andy. And just to help you out, number 3 is very short. Number 1's medium. Number 2's the longest, all right? So you're like, just to set expectations. All right, so number 1, we need to understand the importance of our thoughts. In Proverbs, it says, as a man thinketh, so he is. A little King James for everyone this morning. As a man or as a person thinketh, so they are. The idea of what we think about shaping us is all over Scripture. And I want to look at one passage in particular. If you guys have Bibles, turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. And Paul's going to give us a glimpse of why I think this is so important. 2 Corinthians 10, verses 3 through 4. Paul writes, for although we live in the flesh, we do not wage war according to the flesh, since the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but are powerful through God for the demolition of strongholds. Now, that Greek word translated as powerful, it's the word dunamis. And if you're kind of an etymology nerd, it's kind of cool to think about. It's where we get the word dynamite from. It's a powerful force that moves things and changes things. And that's the miraculous power of God we have access to in the gospel. We're not on our own. But what's the power for? The weapons that we fight with, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. Now, you may not use the word stronghold in your everyday life unless you grew up very charismatic, like my wife. But a stronghold, it comes from the Greek word akuroma. And it was essentially, like back. Matter of fact, we were just in India, and we were at one of the ancient Muslim dynasties, and that kind of dominated. It was like Afghanistan to like Myanmar. It was just like they had all of the South Asia kind of area on lock back in the day, and they had like multiple like walls. And they were in sequential order. There was the big one on the outskirts of town. Then there's one for like where the wealthy people live. Then there's a gate with like an old school like wild kind of castle door. Then there's another wall. Then there's like the king's kind of pad, and there's a tower in the middle. And so the tower is like the stronghold. It's the strongest place of defense. Even if you were able to get through kind of all the walls, you get to a stronghold, you kind of got to go up. You got to go up like the one, spiral staircase. You got to fight off one at a time. And so it's kind of the last holdout, the ancient panic room, if you will. And so Paul's saying, there's a war raging inside of your mind. And it's between the enemies of your soul, what theologians throughout church history have called the world, the flesh, and the devil. And there are enemies trying to get strongholds set up in your mind, strongholds that will keep you from some very important things. Verse 5, Paul says, and every proud thing that is raised up against the knowledge of God, and we take every thought captive to obey Christ. Now, Paul here indicates that what we think, our thoughts, have an impact on our ability to obey Jesus. So this is a really big deal. What we think impacts how we live. So that means our ability to love God and love people, which is your highest calling or purpose, according to Jesus, is affected by what we think. Does that make sense? Your ability to obey Jesus is connected to your ability to take thoughts captive. So what we think about is super important. Dallas Willard, a Chatsworth native, philosophy professor at USC back in the day, he says, the ultimate freedom we have as human beings is the power to select what we will allow or require our minds to dwell upon. Think about that for a second. The ultimate freedom we have as human beings is the power to select what we will allow or require our minds to dwell upon. So Scripture presents a strong link between what we think about and what we feel and who we become. And that link is increasingly being backed up by scientific research. Scientists, therapists, researchers are finding out that what the ancient writers of Scriptures have always seen, and it's this, that there's an inseparable link between what we think, how we feel, and how we live, or how we relate to other people. Clinical psychologist, professor of psychology at St. Mary's, Catherine Pittman writes, the circuits of your brain aren't determined completely by genetics. They're also shaped by your experiences and the way you think and behave. You can remodel your brain to respond differently no matter what your age. There are limits, but there's also a surprising level of flexibility and potential for change in your brain. Which, family, this is incredible news, because it means you can do something about your mental health, your spiritual health, your emotional health. It means that we can be truly intentional with honoring God with our mind, because we're not simply victims to our genetic wiring. Counselor Deborah Folletta adds, the earliest psychologists believed that negative feelings led to negative thoughts. But over the years, psychologists have determined that it's actually the other way around. What we think actually triggers how we feel, which then impacts how we behave. But most people go about their day mindless to how their thoughts are actually impacting them, and unaware that they have the power to change those thoughts. She continues, counselors and psychologists call the concept of taking ownership of your thoughts cognitive behavioral therapy. But it was initially created by the best counselor around, God and Scripture. We see the principle of the power of changing your thoughts referred to as renewing your mind. Romans 12:2 says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Folletta adds, whether we call it cognitive behavioral therapy or renewing of our mind, the bottom line is this: thought change leads to life change. Thought change leads to life change. I've got a slide up here. It's kind of like a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy kind of cycle. And the idea is, in terms of change, it's you have an event that happens in your life, a circumstance or a situation, and you have a thought about that, which causes you to feel some type of way, which causes you to act some type of way. Now, one of the things that happens, a lot of times when people go to therapy, a lot of times they go usually when two of those things are present. When there's a situation that feels outside of their control, like a big moment of loss, a big moment of transition, big problems in a relationship, right? So there's a circumstance that feels too big for them to handle. Or they'll go because there's a behavior they want to change. I have these relational pattern addictions, right? Eating disorders. We can go on and on. It goes, but you have a substance use. You have something that you want to change. You go, I don't think this is healthy. I don't think it's good, and I'm not able to change it on my own. So usually it's the event or the behavior. And oftentimes what good clinicians will do is they're going to go, often we can't change a whole lot about our circumstances. A lot of times what they're going to spend quite a bit of time doing is helping you help you understand what you're feeling, and then understand why you're feeling that way so that you can then work at changing your behavior. Does that make sense? Which is then gives you some freedom within the circumstance. And so this series, I know Brad's already covered the feelings or the emotions side, but I want you to see they're really interconnected. Like thoughts usually flow downhill to the emotions. And so you might have a circumstance that pops up. For example, a few years back, I threw a rager of a birthday party. It was 90s themed. It was tremendous. We had about 50 people at my small house, like 800 square feet, gang of people. Pastor party too, it was wild. And a friend of mine, guys in our church, people started putting stuff on Instagram and like tagging it and what I don't even know. I never had Instagram. It's not tagging. Hashtagging, I don't know. Gets enough traction that his wife's sitting on the couch Saturday night during the party, and she's like, "Yo, what's this? What's this party? This looks tremendous. It's Andy's party. Andy's supposed to be one of your closer friends. You are not invited to this party." Right? Now, an event happened. That was true. There was a birthday that they were not at. The issue was I had invited. My friend, it was a long-term iPhone holdout. He had a Galaxy, had green bubbles. And you guys know how that goes, man. It's crazy. You know, when you send a message to someone on the other side of that blue-green divide, I know America's like the blue-red divide. It's election year. No, man, that blue-green divide gets wild. I've heard rumors that Apple's going to bring in the greens. Some people I really love are greens, okay, guys? But long story short, I sent it to him and I sent it to her, and but long story short, they didn't get it. Sometimes the green even messes up the other blues message. You guys ever seen that before? It's crazy. So Samsung, sue me. Okay, so there was a circumstance. Now, what I want you to catch is there was a feeling of rejection, which is painful. There was a feeling of exclusion, which is painful. Does that make sense? But in between that feeling and that circumstance was an interpretation, aka a thought. And that thought, if they knew, this is a green bubble situation. Andy loves us, right? He's got a big red heart, okay? They're not tripping. They're not into the feeling space. Does that make sense? Now, again, they were mature enough. This is where it helped. It helps that they were godly. He hit me up the next day at church. We had the party on Saturday. He's like, "Hey, man, it seemed like you had a great party yesterday, and it seems like I wasn't invited, and I don't expect that." Some of the people that I saw though, like at the party, I am confused because I feel like I'm closer to you than them, but like, which is true. And I said, "You were invited." And I showed him, and he's like, "Oh my gosh!" Right? Does that make sense? Now we all have those moments. I'm not hating on them. I have those moments. I had a time I would preach, and there was a guy who would get up about 4 times during the sermons, and actually, me and him had some like rough, kind of awkward interactions the 2 months before that when I started noticing it, and eventually, and you know what? How I interpreted it was he can't sit under my preaching because we've had some conflicts. We don't see eye to eye on some political stuff. He's probably going to leave the church soon. And so I'm like, man, I have those thoughts. I gotta chase him down and bring it. I gotta help him, right? I gotta get coffees with him and tell him I love him and I got all this. And so I was like, you know what I could do though? I could just check out my interpretation and ask. And I hit him up and I said, "Hey man, are you struggling to sit under my preaching because I kind of offended you?" And he's like, no, man, we're all good. I have a real small bladder, dude. Like I go pee a lot. He's like, "I always have, by the way. I think you're just noticing it because we've had that," which is fair, but does that make sense? But you see how much emotional turmoil I could get in if I just live in that space of that thought running the show, and it's just not true. So again, we see this link in 2 Corinthians. The ideas become strongholds when they're unchallenged, and strongholds unchallenged impact our ability to obey Jesus. Because you get into that emotional turmoil, removed from the Spirit of God, removed from truth, and then you start you start relating to people in some really unloving ways. I'm not going to invite you to my birthday, right? I'm serious, that happens. Or you're going to gossip about it. Man, it can be this stupid birthday. Should pastors even have birthdays? Because someone's going to get excluded, and then people aren't going to want to be at the church because they don't feel loved by the pastor. I don't know if Andy's got good judgment. Right? All the different ways you could approach some of these things, right? But in Scripture, again, and in good therapy, you'll realize that it's not your circumstances the majority of the time that cause you to feel something. It's your interpretation of said circumstances and the meaning we make of our circumstances that impacts our emotional life. Please hear these next 3 sentences, all right? They're good. In other words, it's our thoughts about our circumstances or relationships that often have the greatest impact on our mental health. Okay. If you're comparing, by the way, there's other physiological realities. I'm just saying, if you have to pick between circumstances and thoughts impact you more. This is why some people can suffer deeply and be crushed by their suffering, and other people can suffer the same circumstances and be resilient. It's why some people lose their faith while suffering and others press into Jesus more. Because there's thoughts, interpretations, and expectations. So a guy who's an expert on burnout and leadership and how they intersect, a guy named Steve Cuss, and he says, exhaustion and burnout have more to do with anxious thoughts about the workload than the workload itself. He goes, high-impact leaders, they like a big workload. They love it, right? But oftentimes what stresses them out isn't the workload, it's what they believe about the workload, what they think's at stake, what they think is on the line. Is it their identity? Is it their value? Preaching is it's pretty hard work. It's not as hard as laying a foundation to a house. But mentally, it's hard work. It's exhausting. Public speaking is exhausting. People giving you feedback on your job every week is exhausting. You guys have 2 reviews a year. You're like, we got emails. You know what I mean? But the work's harder, right? If I think you're disapproving of my message, or I think that you disapproving of my message has anything to do with my value, identity, or worth. They're different things. So it's you can take a vacation or a sabbatical or whatever, but if you don't deal with your thoughts, you're going to be tired again quickly. Does that make sense? So we need to understand the importance of our thoughts. Number 2, we need to engage our thoughts. Notice Paul says we need to take thoughts captive. The idea is like putting a thought in a cage, almost like you're catching a lion, and you're considering it from multiple angles. You're looking at it. Now, you can't take thoughts captive if you don't know what your thoughts are, right? We need to engage them. Imagine trying to catch a lion. We're going to catch a lion. What is a lion? I don't know, man. We're going to take one captive, right? We have to slow down and take stock of what thoughts we have, but often we don't engage our thoughts. By the way, the best book, I think, on thought life, there's a couple good ones I could recommend, but there's one by a woman named Esther Smith, E-S-T-H-E-R, kind of old school Esther spelling, Esther Smith, and the book's called A Still and Quiet Mind. And she is a licensed clinician with rich gospel theology. And she kind of takes rich gospel theology alongside Christian meditation and bilateral stimulation. And she talks through how to really gain peace. And so if you're interested in that, working through your thoughts, I can't encourage you, I can't recommend it enough. It's a fantastic book. But she says that we often are unaware of our thoughts for one of 2 reasons. Some of us tend to avoid our thoughts. And sometimes this is on purpose, and sometimes it's on accident. Sometimes it's like, I don't want to think about that. Literally, I don't want to think about it, and I try to distract myself. But for most of us, it's not, this is, right, Brad Sarian preaches at this church. Smartphones, right? You guys know, smartphones are really, really, really bad, right? Social media, all that stuff. Notifications, all that kind of stuff, right? A lot of times we are, which I mostly agree, by the way. Anyways, I totally agree with it, for the record. Bad joke. I'm on board. But what I'm definitely on board with is they're real distracting. And it's hard to know what you think because you have someone else's thoughts. I mean, if you think about it, that's what notifications are. And articles are, and podcasts are. It's other people's thoughts all day, which makes it real hard to think about your thoughts. And so we are, or we're busy at work, right? It's not on purpose. Or we're having so many thoughts, we're actually overthinking, and we're spiraling, and the thoughts are coming like a mile a minute, and we cannot catch them, right? It's like hundreds of lions. You're like, I can't get my arms around these. I don't know where the thoughts start and end. And so what we need to do is we need to slow down and think about our thoughts. Have you guys ever heard the term metacognition? It's kind of like cognition, thinking, meta, kind of over. You're kind of thinking about thinking. Have you ever heard about that? You're thinking about your own thought processes. Like, man, I tend to think this when this happens. When you do that, it's really helpful. But to do that well, you have to slow down and pay attention. Also, if you want to know what you're thinking, you can move back. Again, remember that cycle. You can move back from what you're feeling, which might be more obvious. I'm feeling really intensely. Whoa, I wonder why. Oh, well, I'm thinking about this thing. I have this, whatever it is. Our emotions are often downhill from our thoughts. Again, remember that cycle. If you're really anxious, angry, happy, or sad, there's often a connection to something you are thinking or believing. I often coach people to pay attention to how their body feels and then work backwards. Pit in my stomach. Whoa, why do you think that is? Anxious. What are you anxious about? This thing at work. Okay, and how's that thing? What do you think about that thing at work? I think if it doesn't go well, I'm gonna die poor and alone. Whatever it is, right? Like you get to the thing that's adding the pressure, and you can find all kinds of thoughts. And once you're able to discover those thoughts, you're gonna find different types of thoughts. Some of the thoughts are good, just straight up. It might sound like they're all bad because I'm talking about how they impact you emotionally. Some good thoughts cause you to feel good emotions. Like that's a reality. Gratitude, great emotion, right? But it's also something you think about. When you're actually actively practicing and thinking about something you're grateful for and thanking Jesus for it, you're able to enjoy it more, whatever it is. Does that make sense? And feel a sense of peace or contentment or joy without having to have everything in your life fixed. It's fascinating. On the flip side, there's a lot of bad thoughts too, spoiler alert. So we're going to talk about those right now, okay? So there's good thoughts. There's also inaccurate thoughts and idolatrous thoughts. Inaccurate thoughts and idolatrous thoughts. Nadia, how much time do we have? Oh, okay. All right, cool. She just said I have 45 more minutes. So just kidding. Okay. So there are inaccurate thoughts and idolatrous thoughts. Again, people that do like CBT work and all that stuff I was describing earlier, where science and psychology have kind of landed, often where scripture lands, there are these things called cognitive distortions. Some people call them thinking traps. And clinicians and therapists will often talk about these, and they're essentially distorted or inaccurate ways of thinking. Okay? We've got a fancy word for that in the Bible. It's called a lie. Lies you're prone to believe. Now, we all have these, by the way. We're all prone to believe lies or cognitive distortions. Often, though, the problem is for some of us, they're our primary way of thinking. They're like the operating system on our iPhone, but to our soul. And one author says they're like a song that gets stuck in our head. And you're not even aware it's playing. I don't know if you've ever had a moment where like you're at a restaurant or a coffee shop and you're meeting with someone and then like a sad song plays. I don't know if you guys ever had this. You get a little teary or like feel a little emotional, but it doesn't match what they're saying. Like it's meaningful. It's someone you care about, but you're like, whoa, I'm just so proud of you. Has anyone ever had that? Okay, maybe just me. But you have moments where like you're unaware that this thing's playing, but it impacts you emotionally. And for a lot of us, that's what's happening. And so often what we want to do is we want to be aware of what this stuff is. And again, in counseling, they would call this cognitive restructuring. And it's kind of like taking that song that's stuck in your head and replacing it with a better song. Now, here's the cool news. Therapy is great. You don't have to be in therapy to do that work, to try to move from believing lies to truth. It's something we're called to do. But again, to be aware of the lies you're believing, you have to know what those lies are. So I want to work through a couple of like the classic cognitive distortions. Again, these are inaccurate thoughts. And by the way, as I read through these, I want you to think through, do I resonate with any of these? Like, are any of these my go-tos? I have 3 that are my jam, all right? Personalization, that's all me, okay? So the first one is black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking, okay? It says, people who struggle with this cognitive distortion have a tendency to see things in extremes rather than having a balanced perspective. They look at things as either black or white, good or bad, helpful or unhelpful, without considering that there may be shades of gray. Things are either amazing or they're terrible. Again, it's so easy to do this. Whenever I have someone who comes to my church for the first time and they tell me, this is the best church I've ever been to in my life. I'm like, in a year, it's going to be the worst church you've ever been to in your life. Because there's no way you have a full, like, does that make sense? Now, again, sometimes it's hyperbolic. They're just saying, I really appreciate it and I'm grateful for what happened today in gathering. But a lot of times it comes with all this stuff, and man, they're full of expectations. This also comes up in our theology at times, or our view of ourself, right? Like, one of the key hallmarks of Christian maturity is seeing yourself as a sinner and a saint at the same time. Like, you're a saint who sins. And so to go, man, I'm just a saint. I don't sin. I'm perfect. I'm not hurting. That's not going to help you grow, right? But at the same time, to go, man, I'm just a sinner. That's all I am. Does that make sense? So maturity is learning to accept the good and bad parts about you simultaneously to become whole. Does that make sense? Here's the truest thing about me, and here's the thing that I do wrestle with. And by the way, we do that with other people. That person, if they made me feel good lately, they're all good. If they made me feel bad, they are all bad. And it's like, probably, like all of us, there's somewhere in between. So we learn to, like, love someone while also being, they can disappoint us or whatever it is. So that's black and white thinking. Another one's overgeneralization. This cognitive distortion is when you take one negative experience or interaction and generalize it to everything else. For example, your boss might comment on the fact that you didn't complete an assignment properly. Instead of seeing this as an isolated incident, you overgeneralize and assume that your boss must be disappointed with everything you're doing at work. Does that make sense? This happens in marriage counseling all the time. They're like, man, she said, I don't like it when you're late. And I just think she hates me. And you're like, whoa. I think she's saying she doesn't like it when you're late. But again, if that's really ingrained, it's hard to shake that. If you have a background where you got blasted a lot, you link these things. Critique means boom, boom, boom. Minimization and magnification. This distortion happens when you have a tendency to make light of good things and or exaggerate the bad things. Does that make sense? For example, it says someone might comment and say they love your outfit. Instead of being grateful for the compliment, you would minimize and say something like, oh, I got this old thing at a thrift store. Magnification, on the other hand, is when you exaggerate the negative. Your husband might tell you he's not a big fan of that new shirt you got, and next thing you know, all you can think about is that comment and start to question what other things he must not love about you, right? Another thing would be like feedback, right? Like if someone, feedback at work, whatever, it's like you just focus on the negative feedback, not the positive. Does that make sense? Or in life, another big thing, in life, the one thing that's not going the way that you want it to, or the three things, that's all that matters. And you don't see the things that you should be grateful for. Again, this is another maturity thing. I'm able to acknowledge the hard and sad in my life, that's truly hard and sad, that's not as God intended it to be, while also being grateful for what is a gift at the same. Does that make sense? Mind reading. This is a version of this happened. I don't want to go too long. This happened with the birthday thing, but it's when you make assumptions about someone else's motives, which, by the way, always leads to a great conflict. If you want like a little fun, you're a little bored, you're like, I could do with like a real heater of a conflict. Tell someone you know what they meant when you can't know what they meant, right? Some of the best fights in my marriage, you guys, classics. ESPN classic worthy level arguments. So we're like, you did this for this, a gray area. I go, you did it for this reason. You were late because you were mad at me. It's real fun. Obviously, it doesn't work. It's a thought that'll stress you out. You'll read into everything, right? Like texts, right? You get a text, it's like, sure. You're like, sure. we talking exclamation point? We talking period? We talking no punctuation? One thing I'll say this: I have started dealing with a lot of men in their 60s and late 50s, working on a construction project at my house right now. We had a flood, and we have to like do reconstruction stuff. And no matter what I send the contractors, they just send back, "Okay, is that good? Okay, did you get the? Okay. Does that make sense?" And I've learned like I think they just say, "Okay, man, like it's okay, it's okay." I don't need to figure that out, right? If I'm texting okay, there's a problem. Okay. Just kidding. Don't read into that if I text you, okay. Another one is it's called fortune telling. And just like you can't know what's going on inside of another person until you ask them and stuff, it's like assuming you know the future, right? Like I know, I had a friend who had a 4.2 in high school, and before every test, her name was Martha. Like Martha Amador. Valedictorian at our high school. Before every test, she's like, I'm gonna fail it, right? Dead serious, stressed out, crying, feeling it. Wasn't the case, didn't it? Does that make sense? So again, we're gonna fail enough in life as finite people who sin and stuff. We don't have to assume it's always gonna happen. Does that make sense? Like if it happens, let it happen. You can work through that when it happens. And then the last two, emotional reasoning. It's also a classic one for a good marriage fight. Because I feel like it's true, it is. Because I feel like you did that thing for that reason, it is. And again, and by the way, I'm not making fun of you. Like I struggle with this one, where I'm just like, it just feels like. It's like, well, it might very well feel that way, but that doesn't mean it's true. Like you need more information. Does that make sense? You got to slow down. It says emotional reasons when we follow feelings rather than facts. It's a dangerous way of thinking because our feelings, well, they're always real. They're not always accurately informed because they can be informed by, bad thinking. And then the last one's personalization. That's when you always assume stuff's about you, right? So someone seems a little off at the office. You're like, they're mad at me, right? And it's like, could be a million things, right? Someone's quiet at GC. They leave early. You're like, mad at me, right? Or another side, they want me to fix this. They want me to ask them what's going on and fix it, right? They said they're stressed about money. I need to give them money. They said they're moving. I need to move them. Does that make sense? Anyways, you make stuff about you. And then the last three types of unhelpful, I'm almost at time. We're very close. The last three are idolatrous thoughts. And these are thoughts. I have another graph for you. This is from a tremendous book called The Abiding Life by Josh Houston. You guys have heard of that book. But he looks at when our minds really get going and when we get really stressed out in life, he says usually it's because we're trying to control things we were never meant to control. We're trying to be our own gods and provide things that only God. And so he breaks up into three sections that really correlate with idols. Bottom right's esteem, affection. So this is you want people to love you, to like you, right? The approval idol or whatever. So if you look on the outside of it, it has what you want to be in control of that you're not in control of, and it's the thoughts and feelings of others. Like you think you have to control them, which is exhausting. And honestly, it makes picking out the clothes you're going to wear that day stressful. Like, I mean, your day gets, Then over here you have security, survival. And if you look outside of that, it's not bad, by the way, to try to survive and be cautious. But when we get to a spot where we're trying to control everything, situations and circumstances, it crushes us because we can't actually do it. If we actually think I have to keep my family safe from everything all the time. My son just got a phone. It's very locked down. It has almost nothing on it. He thinks I'm a lame dad. But he is texting people, and I'm just really aware, like, oh man, kids could hurt his feelings. Like it just reminded me of that again, like how things go in conversation or whatever. And the reality is I can't protect them from all pain or all hardship. And then at the top, there's power control, and that's wanting to control the actions of others, which also doesn't go great over time. Will stress you out, okay? So these are idolatrous thoughts. And by the way, there's a lot of overlap with the cognitive distortions. But it's when we actually go, I'm going to do God's job, or I'm going to look to something other than God for what I need to be happy. And then the last two unhelpful thoughts before we close are inherited thoughts. These are often from your family of origin. They're often identity-oriented. Okay, so you inherit a belief about yourself, like, I need to prove so-and-so right. Some of you guys grew up in families where you kind of told you're the golden child, and everyone agreed. Now, it's kind of cool to be believed in at the t-ball game when you're 6. You're like, man, my dad thinks I can hit. It's another thing when you're like, my family's entire sense of worth is tied to my athletic achievement. Does that make sense? It's one thing to go, well, you got an A+ in your spelling test. It's another thing to go, you're going to make our family. Do you see what I'm saying? That's a thought that will wear you out. And make you feel all kinds of stuff. I need to prove so-and-so wrong on the other end of the spectrum. You were always told, you'll always be, or experiences, that you inherited, more implicit stuff, always be rejected, unwanted, unseen, dismissed, or I'll never be loved, accepted, valued, etc. If you actually believe that, it's going to stress you out and feel some stuff. And then lastly, there's intrusive thoughts. These are thoughts you don't agree with. They feel like they're outside of you. You even find them disturbing. They're like thoughts that keep replaying. And oftentimes these are connected to things like OCD or PTSD. And so if you think this might be you, I'd highly encourage you to fill out a pastoral care and counseling form. We'd love to get you in touch with a licensed clinician to help you with that if you think that might be the case. The stuff I mentioned earlier today, it's not bad. It won't fully address what you need, though, if some of that stuff's going on. Does that make sense? And so as we become aware of our thoughts, we need to slow down and assess them. And one way to do this is by asking questions. This is where I want to land. Let's say we're able to become aware of what we're feeling, what our emotions are. We need to ask ourselves questions like, is this thought true? Is this thought helpful? Is this thought appropriate to my situation? Does this thought line up with what I believe about God, myself, or reality? Esther Smith also recommends asking the question, is this thought complete? Am I seeing the true, but not the full story? Kind of that minimization, maximization stuff. Which leads to this, at the end of the day, point 3, it's the shortest, but maybe the most important. We need to bring our thoughts to Jesus and his people. We need to bring our thoughts to Jesus and his people. We need the help of others to take thoughts captive sometimes. And I know I mentioned intrusive thoughts a second ago and how a therapist would probably be helpful in those cases. But while we don't all need therapists or pastors to help us with our thought life, none of us can do this on our own. We all need people. I don't know where we got the idea that we need to take thoughts captive by ourselves. It's almost like because the thought happens internally, all the work has to happen internally. But actually, there's a lot of freedom in bringing thoughts into the light. There's so much freedom in sharing our thoughts with safe, godly people to take them captive together. Again, who captures a lion on their own? Nobody, right? Maybe someone, I don't know, maybe someone did once, but it's got to be easier with other people, you know what I mean? One therapist I know, she says she has a friend who will ask her, when they meet up, she'll ask her, how are you feeling? And then she'll give a quick response. And then she'll say, how are you thinking? Ooh. But it's like, man, what's on your mind? What do you, right? Again, so many of the cognitive distortions or idolatrous or untrue thoughts are often on repeat, and we're often unaware. And it's looping. Like when you search for one song in Apple Music and you play it, it just plays that song over and over again. Might be a settings thing for me. But often with the help of other people, they can help us see that we're believing something that isn't true, that we miss. Like, whoa, that's a lot of pressure you're putting on yourself. Or, man, are you sure? Or maybe whatever it is. And when we've engaged our thoughts in community, we should do our best to bring them to Jesus. And so I want to read from Philippians 4:6-8 to close us. Paul says, don't worry about anything, but in everything through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Jesus understands you. He understands your thoughts. He's safe. He can help you process through your thoughts. He can remind you that he is in control, so you don't have to be in control of all those things we looked at a second ago. He can remind you you're not defined by your thoughts, and sometimes they're not even your faults. They're outside of you. Paul keeps writing in verse 8, and this is where we'll close. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there is any moral excellence, and if there is anything praiseworthy, dwell on these things. And there is nothing that's more all of those things than Jesus. And so when we go to him in community, we can find so much freedom from the bondage of our thoughts. And so right now we have communion available on the sides. It's a chance to go to Jesus. Maybe you need to confess some idolatrous thoughts where you've tried to take the place of God or look to something other than God to be what only God can be. But we also have, we're going to have prayer counselors available as well. If you want prayer, you're like, sometimes these thoughts are hard and I need help. They would love to pray for you, to bring you into the presence of Jesus. Maybe even, if you're comfortable, maybe even share what a thought is that you're wrestling with. And if the thoughts are too intense or too intrusive or you're too embarrassed, whatever it is, like we would love to get you help with a licensed clinician again. So, but man, bring these thoughts to people and Jesus. I'm going to go ahead and pray. Father, thank you that you think about us. How precious are your thoughts about us, oh Lord. We're not the only ones who think in the room. You think things. You think about us. And you care about us, and you see us, and you care about our thoughts, and you care about our feelings, and you care about our desires. You care about our sin, and you care about our pain. You care about us. And so, Lord, would you help us to receive your help? Would you help us to receive your intervention to stop the steady flow of thinking that's hurting us? We're passing on this inherited story that isn't true. And we're isolated and alone. And maybe we're not on an island, but we're in an island. Our soul's on an island. And Lord, would you welcome us home? Would you remind us you can demolish strongholds and you can free us. Thank you, Jesus, for dying on the cross to make that possible, for rising again in victory, for sending your Spirit to set us free. Because he whom the Son sets free is free indeed.